You know, when you try to picture the people who actually built the modern industrial world, there's almost always this expectation of this raw, visceral, physical conquest.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's the classic American mythos, really.
Yeah. Like if you think about the origins of the oil industry specifically, your brain instantly goes to that cinematic version.
The whole, there will be blood aesthetic.
Exactly. You picture these rugged wildcatters out in a massive rainstorm in Pennsylvania or Texas. They're covered head to toe in this thick, gross mud, risking their lives to just sink a drill bit into the earth.
Right. It's this huge gamble. Man against nature.
Yeah, and then suddenly there's that triumphant rumble from deep underground and a geyser of black gold just shoots up into the sky, and they're standing there, cheering, dancing in the rain of crude oil.
It is an incredibly romantic image, and I think it's one we culturally cling to because, well, we like to think of industry as this visceral struggle against the raw forces of the planet, a gamble where the braves are rewarded by literally striking it rich in the dirt.
Right, it's an amazing story, but, and this is what blew my mind, when you actually start reading through the historical texts and the economic analyses of how this industry became the most powerful force on the planet, that whole movie scene fades out pretty quickly.
Oh, yeah. The reality is much, much quieter and, honestly, a lot more intimidating.
Yeah, because we are not looking at a guy covered in mud. We are looking at a man in a pristine, perfectly tailored suit, sitting in a quiet, sterile office, obsessively, and I mean obsessively, counting microscopic drops of metal on a tin can.
It completely flips the script. I mean, the true foundation of the industry wasn't built on the luck of the drill, right? It was built on a foundation of methodical, almost terrifyingly ruthless efficiency.
Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are taking you through a premise that honestly completely upends how most people view energy and economics. The greatest empire in the history of the oil industry was not built by digging holes in the ground.
No, it really wasn't.
It was built by controlling the pipes, mastering the logistics, and exploiting the extreme molecular chemistry happening entirely above the ground.
And to really grasp how that works, how that power is actually generated,
Yeah.
you have to follow the oil itself. You have to trace its entire life cycle, from the rock all the way to the engine.
And we are going to trace every single step of that journey. We have an incredible stack of material sitting in front of us today to help you visualize this. I mean, we are pulling from deep historical texts on early capitalism and the rise of Standard Oil.
The foundational stuff.
Yeah, but then we've also got these highly technical engineering PDFs that break down linear programming and the supercomputer algorithms used for crude oil blending.
Which gets incredibly complex very fast.
Oh, absolutely. We're looking at precise chemical analyses of something called asphaltene incompatibility from this massive MDPI research study, and we are unpacking economic breakdowns of the commodities futures market.
It's a huge spectrum of information.
It is. Our goal is to take you from the literal seismic thumps of underground exploration through the continent-spanning pipelines and straight into the complex financial math of the crack spread.
Right.
And we are viewing this entire architectural marvel through the foundational vision of one single man, right? John D. Rockefeller.
Because Rockefeller really is the lens through which the modern world makes sense. Understanding the supply chain that he essentially pioneered, it isn't just some dry historical exercise. The logistics and chemistry of how oil moves today dictate the reality of global geopolitics, national security, and, honestly, the underlying economics of almost everything you buy.
Well, let's start at the very beginning. The 1860s and 1870s in the United States. You've got these wildcatters, and the industry at this point is essentially a massive, unregulated casino.
Pure chaos.
Pure chaos. It is defined by these violent boom and bust cycles. A prospector strikes oil, and within weeks, a literal town springs up out of nowhere. You've got luxury hotels, saloons, thousands of people pouring in.
It's just utter madness, yeah.
And then, maybe a year later, the well dries up. The people just leave, the hotels rot, and it becomes a ghost town overnight. Rockefeller looks at this landscape, and he realizes something fundamental about risk.
He realized that he absolutely hated it. Rockefeller despised chaos in all its forms. He looked at the extraction of oil, what we call the upstream sector today, and he saw an inherent, totally unmanageable volatility.
Because you're dealing with geology, right?
Exactly.
Right.
You never knew exactly what you were going to hit, what the quality of the oil would be, or, frankly, how long the pressure in the reservoir would last. It was just a gamble. So he made a very conscious, deliberate decision not to focus his capital on drilling.
He didn't want the risk of finding the oil. He just wanted to be the toll booth that everyone else had to pass through once they did find it.
Precisely. He realized that the real power, and more importantly, the real stability, lay in logistics and refining.
The middleman, essentially, but on a massive scale.
Right. If you control how the raw material moves from point A to point B, and you control the massive industrial facilities that transform that raw, unusable sludge into a product people actually want to buy, which was illuminating kerosene at the time, you control the entire industry. The wildcatters take all the risk. They have to sell to you.
And the way he built that toll booth was through just an absolute obsession with efficiency. I mentioned him counting drops of metal earlier. When I was reading through the Standard Oil history from our sources, I got stuck on this one specific detail about the 39 drops of solder.
Oh, it's such a great story.
It sounds almost apocryphal, like a myth, but it's a documented reality of how his mind worked.
The story of the solder is really the perfect encapsulation of his entire business philosophy. So Rockefeller was walking through one of his manufacturing plants, right? He's inspecting the assembly line for these 5-gallon tin cans they use to ship refined kerosene all over the world.
Just a routine walkthrough.
Yeah. But he stopped and watched the workers sealing the cans. He went up to the manager and asked exactly how many drops of solder they used to seal a single can. And the manager told him they used 40 drops.
40 drops, and most CEOs would just nod and walk away.
But Rockefeller asked them to try sealing the cans with 38 drops instead. So they ran a test batch with 38 drops, and the cans leaked. The seal just wasn't tight enough.
Okay, so that failed.
Right. So Rockefeller told them, okay, try 39 drops. They ran the batch, and the cans didn't leak.
He literally reduced the entire manufacturing process by a single drop of metal.
One single drop. And to a normal person, that seems absurdly pedantic, right? Just crazy micromanagement. But Rockefeller understood scale better than anyone. By reducing the solder from 40 to 39 drops, Standard Oil saved $2,500 in the very first year.
And you have to remember the value of $1 in the late 19th century. That's a massive amount of money.
Exactly. And as Standard Oil's production scaled up massively and they started exporting kerosene globally, that single drop of solder saved the company hundreds of thousands of dollars.
It's the ultimate example of vertical integration. Standard Oil wasn't just buying oil and selling kerosene. They were looking at every single step of the supply chain and asking, how do we own this and how do we make it cheaper? I mean, they didn't even just buy oil barrels from barrel makers.
No. They realized that buying barrels from third parties was a huge variable cost, and honestly, the barrel makers themselves could be unreliable. So Rockefeller just started buying the forests.
He bought the forests.
Yes, he bought massive tracts of timber. He hired his own lumberjacks to cut the white oak, but he didn't stop at just owning the raw material. He analyzed the physical properties of the wood itself. Because when you cut down a tree, the wood is green. It is completely saturated with water.
And water is heavy.
Incredibly heavy.
Yeah.
In the logistics business, weight is your absolute worst enemy because you pay for shipping based on weight.
So if you make barrels out of green wood, you are literally paying the railroads to transport trapped water.
Exactly. So Rockefeller invested in massive kilns. He had his workers kiln dry the wood before it was ever assembled into a barrel. The kilns baked the moisture out of the wood, physically removing the water weight.
That is brilliant.
It made the resulting barrels significantly lighter. When you're shipping millions of barrels on trains, that reduction in dead weight slashes your transportation costs dramatically. Through vertical integration and this kind of physical optimization, he brought the cost of a Standard Oil barrel down from around $2.50 to less than $1.
And then, because the guy is just never satisfied, he eventually pioneers the use of massive iron tank cars on the railroads, which bypasses the need for wooden barrels entirely. You just pump the liquid directly into the train.
Always innovating the logistics.
Right. But this is where the history gets really dark and, frankly, highly controversial. Because he didn't just optimize his own business, he actively used his logistical dominance to crush his competitors. We have to talk about the railroad rebates, and more specifically, the drawbacks.
Right. The rebate system is where Rockefeller truly weaponized his scale. Standard Oil was producing so much refined kerosene that Rockefeller could go to the major railroads, like the Pennsylvania Railroad, the Erie, the New York Central, and offer them something literally no one else could, guaranteed massive daily volume.
He could fill their trains every single day.
Exactly. And in exchange for that volume, he demanded secret discounts on the shipping rates. These were the rebates.
So if the public right to ship a barrel of oil is $1, Rockefeller is secretly only paying, what, 50 cents?
Yeah, somewhere around there. But as you mentioned, that rebate wasn't even the most devastating tool. The ultimate weapon was the drawback.
This part is just ruthless.
It really is. Rockefeller didn't just negotiate a discount for his own oil. He forced the railroads to agree to a system where every time one of his competitors shipped a barrel of oil on that railroad at the full $1 price, the railroad had to take a percentage of that competitor's payment, say 25 cents, and hand it directly to Rockefeller.
That is just structurally devastating. If you are a competing refiner, you are literally subsidizing Standard Oil every time you ship your own product. You cannot mathematically survive that.
No, you just bleed to death financially.
It makes me think of the accusations against massive tech monopolies today. You know, Rockefeller didn't care about creating the content, the drilling of the oil. He wanted to own the platform and the algorithm. The platform was the transportation network, and the algorithm was his hyper-efficient refineries. Once you control the platform, you dictate the terms of survival to everyone else.
It's a very apt analogy. I mean, Rockefeller proved the fundamental architecture of the modern oil and gas value chain. He proved that the upstream exploration and production carries all the geological risk. But the midstream, the transportation, the pipelines, the storage tanks, and the downstream, the refining and marketing, that is where you can mathematically engineer guaranteed profits.
And when the platform was threatened, he adapted. Like when the independent producers got desperate and tried to build the Tidewater pipeline, this massive long-distance pipe to move oil over the mountains and bypass the railroads entirely. Rockefeller didn't just rely on his train monopolies, right?
No, he saw that pipelines were the new, more efficient platform. So he just built his own. He created the National Transit Company and strung a massive web of his own pipelines across the country, completely isolating the railroads he used to rely on.
He always moved to where the physical leverage was. He realized that controlling the physical movement and storage of the molecules was the ultimate chokehold on the market.
Always.
So holding that thought, the idea that the physical movement of the oil is where the real leverage lies, let's fast forward to the present day. If Rockefeller's blueprint is still the foundation, what does that physical movement look like right now? Like, how do we actually pull this off in the modern world?
Well, we can trace it through the three major sectors we just established. Let's start upstream. Today, exploration and production is a realm of extreme, almost science fiction level technology. We aren't just poking holes in the dirt hoping to get lucky anymore.
No, the engineering documents we have are insane. They detail the use of 3D and 4D seismic imaging. And when I was reading about this, the mechanics of it are fascinating. It's essentially like giving the Earth a giant ultrasound, right?
That is exactly what it is. Geophysicists use these massive thumper trucks, these heavy vehicles that drop huge hydraulic plates onto the ground, or if they're offshore, they use air guns trailing behind ships. And they send incredibly powerful low-frequency sound waves deep into the Earth's crust.
And what happens when the sound waves go down?
Well, as those sound waves travel downward, they hit different layers of rock, sandstone, limestone, shale. Because each rock type has a completely different density, the sound waves bounce back to the surface at different speeds and angles.
And they capture those echoes using, like, thousands of sensors spread across the surface?
Yes, geophones on land or hydrophones in the water. They collect all of these returning signals, and then supercomputers process the data to build massive, highly detailed, three-dimensional digital maps of the rock formations miles underground. They can literally see the traps where hydrocarbons are hiding.
Wow.
And with 4D seismic, the fourth dimension is time. They take 3D images over several years to watch how the fluids inside the reservoir are physically moving as they pump the oil out.
That eliminates so much of that wildcatter risk. And once they find it, getting it out has totally transformed too. The sources focus heavily on hydraulic fracking and horizontal drilling. I mean, this was the technology that fundamentally rewrote the global energy map over the last, 15 years?
It absolutely did. For decades, geologists knew there were massive amounts of oil and gas trapped in shale rock formations, like the Permian Basin in Texas or the Bakken in North Dakota. The problem was that shale is incredibly tight rock. It lacks permeability. The oil is trapped in microscopic pores, and it just can't flow to a traditional vertical well.
It's like trying to suck a thick milkshake through a straw that's packed tight with solid clay. Nothing moves.
Exactly. So the industry developed a two-part solution. First, horizontal drilling. They drill down vertically for 2 or 3 miles, and then, and this is wild, they physically curve the drill bit 90 degrees and drill horizontally through the shale layer for another 2 or 3 miles.
So they're just running parallel to the surface, miles underground.
Right, which exposes a massive amount of the well pipe directly to the oil-bearing rock.
But the rock is still tight, right? The oil still won't just flow out.
which is where the fracking comes in. They put millions of gallons of water mixed with specific chemicals and fine sand down into that horizontal pipe at extreme, incredibly high pressures. The pressure is so immense that it physically fractures the shale rock around the pipe, creating thousands of tiny cracks.
And the sand is the key part of that mixture, right? They call it a proppant.
Yes, a proppant. When the pressure is released and the water flows back out, those massive cracks would normally just snap shut under the weight of the earth. But the grains of sand get wedged into the fractures. They literally prop the cracks open. And through those tiny sand-filled pathways, the trapped oil and gas can finally flow into the well and up to the surface.
Okay, so the oil is out of the ground. The upstream has done its job. Now we enter the midstream. This is the transportation, the pipelines, the storage. This is Rockefeller's modern toll booth. And if you look at the map of North America, the absolute, undisputed beating heart of this entire logistical web is a town in the middle of nowhere, Cushing, Oklahoma.
Oh, Cushing. It is one of the most vital pieces of infrastructure on the planet. If you ever drive through it, it's just endless horizons of massive white cylindrical steel storage tanks. The sources show that Cushing has the capacity to hold over 90 million barrels of crude oil at any given moment.
Why Cushing, though? Why Oklahoma?
It's all about geographical intersection. It is the crossroads where dozens of major pipelines meet. You have pipes bringing heavy crude down from Alberta, Canada. You have pipes bringing light crude in from the shale basins in Texas and North Dakota. And then from Cushing, massive outbound pipelines pump that gathered oil down to the sprawling refinery complexes on the U.S. Gulf Coast. It's the grand central station of crude oil.
But it's not just a physical hub where oil sloshes around in tanks, right? It is a huge financial hub. Cushing is the designated physical delivery point for the NYMEX WTI futures contracts. WTI being West Texas Intermediate, which is the benchmark price for U.S. oil.
And this is exactly where the physical world and the financial world collide. The futures market allows producers and refiners to lock in prices months in advance, which brings stability to the industry. But it also attracts massive amounts of financial speculation. Day traders, hedge funds, banks, they buy and sell millions of these paper contracts every day without ever intending to touch a single drop of actual oil.
Right, which brings me to a very practical question that I think a lot of people have. If you are sitting at home in your pajamas trading commodities on your laptop and you buy a WTI futures contract and you accidentally hold on to it until it expires, does a pipeline company literally dispatch a truck to your house and try to pump 1,000 barrels of crude oil onto your front lawn?
Well, no, they won't ruin your lawn. But the threat of physical delivery is very real, and it is the absolute only mechanism that keeps the entire paper market honest. A futures contract is a legally binding agreement. If you hold that contract at the exact moment of expiration, you are legally obligated to take physical delivery of 1,000 barrels of West Texas Intermediate crude oil.
So what actually happens to the guy in his pajamas?
That delivery doesn't happen at your house. It legally must happen at one of the approved interconnected terminals in Cushing, Oklahoma. So to take delivery, you would need to have already leased physical space in one of those massive steel tanks in Cushing, or you would need to own capacity on an outbound pipeline to move it immediately.
And if you don't?
If you don't have either of those things, you are in breach of a massive commercial contract. And the financial penalties, the frantic scrambling to liquidate your position, it will utterly wipe you out.
And that physical constraint, the absolute necessity of having an empty steel tank to put the oil in, is exactly what caused the most mind-bending financial anomaly in the history of the oil market. Let's talk about April 2020.
April 2020, that was the ultimate stress test of the midstream sector. So when the COVID-19 pandemic triggered global lockdowns, the transportation sector simply stopped. I mean, airplanes were grounded, daily commuting just vanished, factories idled. The global demand for refined fuels evaporated almost overnight.
But the upstream sector doesn't just stop on a dime, right?
Exactly. You can't just flip a switch on a well.
Yeah.
The oil wells in Texas, the Middle East, Russia, they were still pumping millions of barrels of crude out of the ground every single day. But the refineries, realizing nobody was buying gasoline, slowed down their processing. And because they slowed down, they stopped buying new crude from the pipelines.
So the oil has to go somewhere, the midstream pipes start backing up, and all that crude starts flowing into the storage tanks at Cushing.
And the tanks started filling up. Fast. The physical reality of the infrastructure was reaching its absolute limit. And as we approached the expiration date for the May WTI futures contract, the traders holding those paper contracts suddenly looked at the physical data coming out of Cushing, and they realized a terrifying truth. There was no storage left. Every single tank was leased. It was full.
So if you are a trader holding a contract, and expiration is coming up, you have to sell it to someone else to avoid taking physical delivery. But you can't sell it to a refiner because they aren't refining, and you can't sell it to a storage company because their tanks are totally full.
Precisely. The music stopped, and there were literally no chairs left. The traders panicked. They absolutely could not take physical delivery, so they started offering the contracts for cheaper and cheaper. $10, $5, $1.
That nobody would take them?
No, because holding the contract meant you had to take the physical oil, and there was nowhere to put it.
The physical constraint just completely broke the financial math.
It really did. To avoid the massive legal penalties of breaching the delivery contract, traders literally had to pay someone, anyone who might have a scrap of storage space left, to take the contract off their hands. The price of the WTI futures contract broke through zero and plunged into negative territory.
I remember watching the screens that day.
It closed at negative $37.63 a barrel. You were paying someone nearly $40 to take a barrel of oil away from you.
It is the ultimate vindication of Rockefeller's worldview. I mean, you can play all the financial games you want on Wall Street, but eventually, the paper price must converge with the physical reality of the midstream infrastructure. If the pipes and the tanks are full, your paper wealth means absolutely nothing.
It was a historic demonstration of the physical limits of the toll booth.
Okay, so Cushing holds millions and millions of barrels. The tanks are massive. But here is where we need to dive into the chemistry, because not all of the oil sitting in those tanks is created equal. Oil isn't just one homogeneous liquid.
Yeah.
And going back to Rockefeller, he built a massive chunk of his empire by figuring out how to refine the absolute worst, most foul-smelling oil available when his competitors thought it was just garbage. So we need to look at what is actually flowing through those pipes at a molecular level. Let's break down the two vital metrics of crude oil: API gravity and the sweet-sour divide.
This is where we move from logistics into chemistry. The entire global pricing structure of crude oil is dictated by these two chemical classifications. The first metric is density, and in the oil industry it is measured by API gravity. API stands for the American Petroleum Institute.
Why do they use a special scale, though? Why not just measure the specific gravity compared to water like we do in basic physics?
Well, they essentially do, but the API scale is an inverse measure that was adopted specifically for the petroleum industry to make the numbers easier to work with. If you use standard specific gravity, most oil falls between 0.8 and 0.95, which are just fractions. It's annoying to trade on fractions. The API formula takes the specific gravity, runs it through a specific equation, and spits out a nice whole number.
And the baseline to remember for the listener is water, right? Water has an API gravity of exactly 10.
Correct. Because it's an inverse scale, if the API value of the oil is greater than 10, it is lighter than water, which means it will float. If the API value is less than 10, it is heavier than water, and it will sink.
So how does the industry actually categorize this?
The sources outline four main categories based on this density. At the very top, you have light crude oil. This is anything with an API gravity above 31.1 degrees. Light crude is the holy grail.
Because it's easier to move.
That's part of it. It has low viscosity, meaning it flows very easily through pipelines without needing to be heated. But more importantly, when you put it into a refinery, the molecular chains are already relatively short. It naturally yields a very high percentage of highly valuable products like gasoline, jet fuel, and diesel, with minimal basic processing.
Then below that, you have medium crude, which sits between, 22.3 and 31.1 degrees?
Right. Medium is exactly what it sounds like. And then you drop into heavy crude, which is anything below 22.3 degrees API. Heavy crude is entirely different. It is thick, viscous, and dark.
It's the sludge.
Exactly. The carbon molecules in heavy crude are massive, long, complex chains. To turn heavy crude into anything useful, like gasoline, a refinery has to physically break those giant molecules apart. That requires immense heat, extreme pressure, and incredibly expensive complex machinery.
And the bottom of the barrel is extra heavy, or bitumen, which is below 10 degrees. It actually sinks in water. It's so thick it's almost solid at room temperature, like tar. You practically have to mine it rather than pump it.
Exactly, like the oil sands in Canada.
Yep.
So that is density. The second vital metric is the sulfur content. And this is where we get the very distinct industry terms sweet and sour crude.
Which originally comes from the fact that the early wildcatters would literally taste the oil to test it, right?
They absolutely did. I mean, they didn't have mass spectrometers in the 1860s. They relied on their senses. If the oil had a relatively mild, slightly sweet smell and a sweet taste, it meant the sulfur content was very low. Today, we measured scientifically, of course. The cutoff is 0.5%. If a crude oil has less than 0.5% sulfur by weight, it is officially classified as sweet.
And sweet crude is highly desirable because it's clean.
It is incredibly clean. It is much easier to refine, and when you burn the resulting fuels, they don't release massive amounts of sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere, which is what causes acid rain.
But if the sulfur content is above 0.5%, it is classified as sour crude. And sour crude is nasty, dangerous stuff.
It is genuinely hazardous. The sulfur in crude oil doesn't just sit there benignly. It forms compounds like hydrogen sulfide gas, which is incredibly toxic and can be lethal to workers if inhaled. Beyond the human danger, sulfur is highly corrosive.
It eats the metal.
Yes. If you run sour crude through standard steel refinery pipes, the sulfur compounds will eat away at the metallurgy. To make legal, usable gasoline out of sour crude, a refinery has to build and operate massive, expensive desulfurization units to literally strip the sulfur molecules out of the hydrocarbons.
So when you combine these two metrics, density and sulfur, you start to understand why certain oils are famous. When you hear financial news anchors talking about West Texas Intermediate WTI or Brent crude from the North Sea, the reason those are the global benchmark prices is because they are light sweet crudes.
Right, the gold standard.
WTI has an API of around 40, which is very light, and a sulfur content of roughly 0.4%, which is sweet. It's the perfect starting material.
Contrast that with something like Arab Heavy or Maya crude from Mexico. Those are heavy, thick, and highly sour. They're much more difficult to handle.
And this brings us right back to Rockefeller and one of the greatest technological gambles Standard Oil ever took. When we talk about how he capitalized on chemistry, we have to look at the Lima, Ohio oil discovery.
The Lima discovery is just a brilliant piece of chemical history. In the 1880s, massive oil fields were discovered in Lima, Ohio. But there was a huge problem. The oil was incredibly sour.
How sour are we talking?
It was so laden with sulfur compounds that the industry literally called it skunk oil. It smelled so abhorrently bad that you couldn't use it to make illuminating kerosene for indoor lamps because burning it would drive people out of their homes. It reeked.
The smell was totally intolerable, so the independent refiners couldn't process it, and they thought the oil was utterly useless. The price of Lima crude collapsed to almost nothing.
But Rockefeller looked at it differently. He knew that if you could figure out a way to break the chemical bond between the hydrocarbon and the sulfur, you would have an ocean of perfectly good oil.
Yeah.
So while everyone else was ignoring it, Standard Oil started quietly buying up millions of barrels of this worthless skunk oil for pennies on the dollar. They stockpiled over 40 million barrels of it in massive tank farms.
Because he knew he was going to hire a guy named Herman Frasch.
Yes. Rockefeller hired Herman Frasch, a brilliant chemist. Frasch spent years in the laboratory, funded by Standard Oil, until he finally cracked the code. He developed a desulfurization process where they distilled the sour crude in the presence of copper oxide.
And what does a copper oxide do?
The copper oxide naturally reacted with the sulfur in the oil, binding with it to form copper sulfide. This effectively stripped the sulfur right out of the liquid.
Leaving behind pure, sweet, odorless kerosene.
Exactly. And overnight, because of that one chemical breakthrough, Standard Oil's massive 40 million barrel stockpile of supposedly worthless skunk oil was transformed into an absolute fortune.
It's just staggering vision. If you think about this entire dynamic, the density and the sulfur in everyday terms, I think it makes perfect sense. Light sweet crude is essentially like a premium, incredibly tender, expensive filet mignon. You take it home, you throw it in a basic, cheap frying pan, you give it a quick sear for 2 minutes on each side, and you have a $100 meal. The raw ingredient is so good, the processing is effortless.
That's a perfect analogy.
But heavy sour crude is like a really tough, thick, gristly, cheap cut of chuck meat. You can certainly make it edible, and you can make a profit on it because it's so cheap to buy. But you can't just throw it in a frying pan. You need a pressure cooker. You need exact high-temperature controls. You need to cook it for hours and hours, and you need to add expensive spices, the desulfurization, just to make it taste good.
And because of that physical reality, the market has a strict pricing hierarchy. Light sweet crude always commands a premium price. Heavy sour crude trades at a steep discount, which the industry calls the sour differential.
So it's cheaper.
Much cheaper. If WTI is trading at $80 a barrel, a heavy sour crude might trade at $65 or $70.
Yeah.
But here is the critical catch, and the reason why this entire system is so fragile. To use your meat analogy, You cannot cook that tough, gristly meat in just any kitchen. You need a kitchen that was custom built, with heavy-duty pressure cookers specifically designed to handle it.
Which brings us to the downstream sector, the refineries. Because holding all that discounted sour crude is useless if you don't have the equipment to cook it. And this transitions us into a massive, highly complex geopolitical bottleneck that the global energy market is grappling with right now.
Right.
Let's look at the European refinery network and something the sources call the European technological trap. But before we get to Europe, we need to understand how we measure the kitchen.
To understand why Europe is trapped, we have to look at how the industry measures a refinery's actual capabilities.
Yeah.
Refineries are not just generic boiling pots where you dump oil in and get gas out. They're highly specific chemical plants. We measure their capability using something called the Nelson Complexity Index, or NCI.
How does the NCI work? Like, what do the numbers mean?
The Nelson Complexity Index measures a refinery's ability to upgrade low-quality, heavy crude into high-value light products. A basic refinery, essentially just a distillation tower that boils the oil to separate the natural fractions, has an NCI of 1. The more complex secondary processing units you add to the refinery, the higher the NCI goes.
So a higher NCI number means a much more complex, capable, and fundamentally expensive refinery.
Precisely. For context, if you look at the refineries built along the U.S. Gulf Coast in Texas and Louisiana, they have an incredibly high average NCI of around 9.5 to 11. They are absolute engineering marvels. They have massive, multi-billion-dollar pieces of equipment called coking units, or cokers.
Okay, explain what a coker actually does mechanically.
When you distill heavy crude after you boil off all the easy gasoline and diesel, you are left with a thick, heavy, tar-like residual at the bottom of the barrel. In a simple refinery, that residual is just sold as cheap asphalt or heavy ship fuel. But a coking unit takes that heavy residual and subjects it to extreme thermal cracking.
Thermal crack.
Yeah. We are talking about heating this sludge to over 900 degrees Fahrenheit under intense pressure. At that temperature, the massive hydrocarbon molecules physically break or crack into shorter chains. This allows the refinery to squeeze even more highly valuable gasoline and diesel out of what was essentially garbage.
They have the ultimate pressure cookers.
They do. They can buy the absolute cheapest, heaviest, most sour Mexican or Canadian crude, run it through their high NCI equipment, and still produce premium gasoline. Now, contrast that Gulf Coast capability with the European refinery network. According to the data in the sources, the average NCI across European refineries is much lower, sitting around 6.5.
That's a massive capability gap, so they don't have the same deep conversion coking units or heavy-duty desulfurization capacity.
They don't. And this leads us to the assay trap. An assay is the specific chemical fingerprint of a particular crude oil. Because building a refinery costs billions of dollars, you don't just build a generic one. You engineer the metallurgy, the pipe thickness, and the heat exchangers for a specific assay.
You build it for a specific type of oil.
Exactly. And many European refineries, particularly those in Central and Eastern Europe, were custom designed and built decades ago for the exact chemical fingerprint of one single type of oil. Russian Urals crude.
Let's look at the profile of Urals. The sources state it is a medium sour blend. It has an API gravity of around 31 and a sulfur content of roughly 1.5%.
Right. It's not too heavy, but it has a significant amount of sulfur. The European refineries were built with just enough NCI capability to handle that specific 1.5% sulfur level and no more. They were perfectly optimized for Urals.
Now, looking at the geopolitical shift detailed in the sources, and we were just looking at these strict logistical and chemical facts of this situation impartially, the Russo-Ukrainian conflict and the subsequent Western sanctions forced Europe to abruptly stop buying Russian Urals crude.
The political decision was made to halt the flow.
Exactly. But from an engineering standpoint, because their NCI is stuck at 6.5, they couldn't just pivot and buy heavy sour crude from Venezuela or even ultralight sweet crude from the U.S. Permian Basin.
That is the trap. The political reality demanded they switch suppliers instantly, but the chemical reality of their steel pipes made it physically impossible to do so without severe consequences.
But let me push back on this, because I think a lot of people might be confused by that. If a refinery is just a giant industrial heater, why does the specific crude matter so much? Like, if you put a slightly different oil in, can't the engineers just adjust the dials, turn up the heat, change the flow rate?
It is a totally logical question, but it fundamentally underestimates how sensitive these metallurgical ecosystems are. It is not just about heat. It is about molecular corrosion. Let's say a European refinery, built for medium sour Urals, desperately buys a batch of heavy sour crude because it's cheap. That heavy crude contains specific organic acids called naphthenic acids.
Naphthenic acids, what do they do?
They are highly corrosive. When heated to refining temperatures, naphthenic acids actively attack the iron in the carbon steel pipes. The acid reacts with the iron to form iron naphthenate, which literally eats away the thickness of the pipe walls from the inside out.
Oh.
Yeah. A refinery built for Urals doesn't have the high-alloy stainless steel required to resist naphthenic acid attack. Within months, the pipes would thin out, risk rupturing, and cause a catastrophic fire.
So the chemistry literally destroys the machinery.
Yes. And beyond corrosion, there's the issue of fouling. If you run a crude that is too heavy, the heavy sludge bakes onto the insides of the heat exchangers. Think of it like burning a thick layer of carbon onto the bottom of your frying pan.
I've done that. It ruins the pan.
Exactly. Once that sludge bakes on, the metal can no longer transfer heat efficiently to the oil. The entire thermal efficiency of the plant collapses. The refinery is forced to initiate an unplanned shutdown, let the equipment cool, and send workers in to physically scrape the sludge out of the pipes. An unplanned shutdown can cost a refinery millions of dollars a day in lost revenue.
Wow. So they are well and truly locked in. They have to find replacement crudes that perfectly match the Urals assay, which means competing globally for a very narrow slice of the oil market, which obviously drives up their costs.
It's a huge logistical headache.
And the sources note that this logistical headache is about to become a full-blown nightmare. There are upcoming European Union regulations set for January 2026 that require extreme molecule-level traceability.
The 2026 regulations are going to test the absolute limits of global supply chain auditing. The EU wants to ensure that no refined products, no diesel, no jet fuel, entering their market from third-party countries like India or Turkey originated from Russian crude oil.
But how do you even prove that? Once oil is refined into diesel, the molecules look exactly the same, don't they?
That is the problem. You can't test the diesel to see where it came from. So the regulation requires strict physical segregation at the refinery level. If a massive refinery in India processes both Russian crude and Saudi crude, they have to prove to the EU that the specific batch of diesel they are exporting to Europe came from a production line that has not touched a single drop of Russian oil for the preceding 60 days.
Wait, really? 60 days?
Yes. It requires separate storage tanks, separate pipes, separate distillation runs, and an army of auditors to verify the physical isolation of the molecules. It is an administrative and logistical burden that many global refineries simply will not be able to accommodate.
So if a refinery is navigating this minefield, locked into buying specific, expensive crudes so their pipes don't dissolve and facing massive regulatory compliance costs, how do they actually know if they're surviving economically? Because a refinery doesn't control the price of the raw crude oil they buy, and they don't control the global price of the gasoline they sell. They are completely squeezed in the middle.
Which introduces the single most important financial metric in the downstream sector. It is the literal pulse of the refining industry. It is a calculation known as the crack spread.
I love that term, the crack spread. It sounds incredibly intense.
It does, yeah. The name obviously comes from the physical engineering process we just discussed, thermal or catalytic cracking of long-chain hydrocarbon molecules into shorter ones. But financially, the crack spread is the mathematical difference between the cost of the raw crude oil going into the front end of the plant and the combined price of all the refined products coming out the back end.
So it's a profit margin.
Exactly. It represents the gross margin of the refinery. And because crude oil yields dozens of different products, from propane to jet fuel to asphalt, the industry uses a simplified, standardized benchmark to track profitability. It is called the 3-2-1 crack spread.
The 3-2-1. Okay, let's walk through the math of this clearly because the sources lay this out perfectly. And it is the key to understanding how these massive companies make money. The 3-2-1 benchmark assumes a standard output ratio. It assumes that if you put exactly 3 barrels of raw crude oil into a refinery, the physical and chemical processes will yield approximately 2 barrels of gasoline and 1 barrel of distillate.
Right. Distillate being primarily diesel fuel and heating oil. 3 barrels in, 2 + 1 out.
But the math requires a conversion, right? Because the commodities markets price these things differently. Crude oil is traded and priced in barrels. But gasoline and diesel are traded and priced in gallons.
And as every oil trader knows, there are exactly 42 gallons in a standard barrel of oil.
Right. So to calculate the spread, you have to convert the products back to a per barrel revenue figure and then subtract the cost of the crude. The formula is actually quite elegant. Let's lay it out.
Okay, first you calculate the revenue from the gasoline. You take the current market price of gasoline per gallon, multiply it by 42 to get the price per barrel, and then multiply that by 2 because you are getting 2 barrels of gas out of the ratio.
Okay, got it.
Then you calculate the diesel revenue. You take the market price of diesel per gallon, multiply by 42, and multiply by 1. You add the gasoline revenue and the diesel revenue together. This gives you the total revenue for your 3-barrel batch. You divide that total revenue by 3. This gives you the average blended revenue for one single barrel of output. Finally, you take that number and simply subtract the current market price of 1 barrel of crude oil. The resulting number is the 3-2-1 crack spread, expressed in dollars per barrel.
So I'm thinking about this conceptually. It is exactly the same math as running a bakery. The crack spread is the difference between the wholesale cost of your raw ingredients, your sacks of flour, sugar, and eggs, and the retail price of the finished wedding cakes you sell in the window.
That's a great way to think about it.
The bakery owner doesn't inherently care if a sack of flour costs $1 or if a massive wheat shortage makes it cost $100. As long as the price of the finished cake rises proportionally so that the margin in the middle remains profitable, the bakery survives.
That is precisely how refiners view the global market. They are fundamentally margin businesses. They don't care if oil is at $40 or $100, so long as the crack spread remains wide. Historically, according to the economic data in our sources, a healthy 3-2-1 crack spread is generally between $10 and $20 per barrel. That $15 margin gives them enough room to cover their massive operating costs, the electricity, the natural gas to fire the heaters, the union wages, the constant maintenance, and still return a solid profit to their shareholders.
But those margins are incredibly volatile. The sources point out that geopolitical shocks can blow that spread wide open. When the Ukraine conflict started, Europe suddenly lost access to massive amounts of refined Russian diesel.
Right, the supply shock.
The supply of diesel collapsed, which caused the price of diesel per gallon to absolutely skyrocket on the open market, while the price of crude oil stayed relatively stable.
And because the diesel price skyrocketed, the math of the formula exploded. Refiners were suddenly seeing crack spreads spike to record highs of $55 or even $60 per barrel. They were making unprecedented historic profits simply because the geopolitical math worked in their favor.
But the pendulum swings both ways. What happens when the spread collapses?
Well, if there's a massive glut of gasoline on the market, the price of gas drops. If the crack spread narrows to $2 a barrel or even goes negative, which happens during deep recessions, the refinery is literally losing money on every single barrel of crude they push through the pipes. And this is vital to understand. The crack spread dictates global fuel supply.
Because if a refiner is losing money, they don't just keep running the machines out of the goodness of their hearts.
Exactly. If the spread is negative, the refinery managers make a purely economic decision. They throttle back production, they run the plant at 70% capacity instead of 95%, or they decide it's a great time to shut the plant down entirely for a few weeks of routine maintenance.
Which instantly constricts the supply of new gasoline and diesel flowing into the market. And because supply drops while demand stays the same, the price of gasoline at the pump starts to rise. It rises until the crack spread becomes profitable again.
It is a brutal but perfectly self-correcting macroeconomic mechanism. But because those swings can be so violent, refiners cannot just leave their survival up to chance. They have to actively manage their price risk.
Which they do using the futures market, right? The NYMEX contracts we talked about earlier.
Yes, hedging is critical. A refinery will look at the futures curve and lock in a profitable margin months before they ever buy the oil. They will simultaneously buy crude oil futures contracts locking in their raw material cost, and sell RBOB gasoline and heating oil futures contracts locking in their future revenue. By doing both at the exact same time, they mathematically guarantee their crack spread margin, protecting themselves from whatever chaos happens in the physical market.
Okay, but here is where we get to the absolute pinnacle of this industry's engineering genius. When the macroeconomic environment is stable, when the crack spread is tight and margins are razor thin, refiners can't just rely on Wall Street paper hedges to save them. They have to engineer their own profits on the physical side down to the molecular level.
Which brings us all the way back to the modern equivalent of Rockefeller, meticulously counting his 39 drops of solder.
Exactly. This is where we enter the high-stakes realm of blending and what the industry calls opportunity crudes. This is the real battleground for profitability in the modern downstream sector.
It really is.
The sources, specifically this incredibly dense MDPI chemical research paper, dive deep into the mechanics of this. Explain what an opportunity crude actually is.
Opportunity crudes are exactly what the name implies. They represent a massive financial opportunity because they are deeply, significantly discounted. These are crude oils that are inherently difficult to refine. They might be extremely heavy, have very high sulfur content, or contain high levels of corrosive naphthenic acids. Because most simple refineries can't process them, the producers have to sell them at a massive discount compared to the WTI benchmark.
They are the cheap, tough cuts of meat. But as we just spent 20 minutes establishing, a refinery can't just dump a highly acidic, heavy crude into pipes designed for light sweet crude. It will corrode the metallurgy and cause catastrophic fouling. So if they want to capture that discount, what do?
They blend it. Crude oil blending is the practice of mixing expensive, high-quality light sweet crude with these cheap, difficult opportunity crudes. The ultimate goal is to create a customized synthetic crude oil mixture that exactly matches the specific assay requirements of the refinery's hardware, but achieves that chemical profile at the absolute lowest possible raw material cost.
It's a brilliant concept, to use our analogy. You take the expensive filet mignon, you throw it in an industrial meat grinder with the cheap, tough gristle, and you churn out a perfectly acceptable, highly profitable hamburger that cooks perfectly on your existing grill.
It is brilliant, but it carries a massive existential risk. And this is exactly what the MDPI study analyzes in excruciating detail. The risk is incompatibility.
Incompatibility.
When you mix two different types of crude oil together, they do not always play nicely. Crude oil is not a simple fluid. It is a highly complex, delicate colloidal suspension of thousands of different hydrocarbon molecules. And the key players in this chemical drama are known as the SARA fractions.
SARA, saturates, aromatics, resins, and asphaltenes. Let's break those down, because understanding this interaction is the key to the whole process. Asphaltenes are the troublemakers here, right?
Asphaltenes are the heaviest, most complex, most polar molecules in crude oil. You can think of them as microscopic, solid, carbon-rich particles suspended within the liquid oil. In a stable, unblended crude, these solid asphaltene particles stay suspended. They remain dispersed because of the resins.
What do the resins do?
The resin molecules are highly polar. They are attracted to the asphaltenes. The resins physically cluster around the solid asphaltene particles, creating a protective spherical shell in the cell. This resin shell acts as a buffer, preventing the asphaltene particles from touching each other and clumping together. As long as the resin shell is intact, the asphaltenes remain stable and flow with the liquid.
But what happens when the refinery starts blending? What happens when they pump that heavy opportunity crude into a tank with a highly refined, light sweet crude?
This is where the chemistry breaks down. Light crudes are very high in saturates. These are simple, non-polar alkane molecules. When you introduce a massive volume of nonpolar saturates into the mix, it fundamentally changes the solvent power of the liquid. The saturates essentially dissolve and strip away that protective polar resin shell from the asphaltenes.
They strip the armor off.
Exactly. And the moment that protective resin shell is gone, the raw, highly polar asphaltene particles are exposed to each other. They immediately attract one another. They flocculate, they clump together, grow in size, and suddenly they precipitate out of the liquid phase. The microscopic particles instantly turn into a solid, sticky, black sludge that drops out of the oil.
That sounds absolutely disastrous for industrial machinery.
It is the single greatest fear of a refinery engineer. Because once that solid asphaltene sludge precipitates inside the pipes, it is almost impossible to remove. It coats the insides of the pipelines. It completely clogs the intricate bundles of tubes inside the heat exchangers, destroying the thermal transfer. It fouls the distillation towers. If the precipitation is severe enough, it will literally choke the flow of the entire refinery, forcing a catastrophic emergency shutdown.
So it's exactly like a bartender trying to maximize the profit margin on a cocktail. They take a tiny splash of premium, top-shelf liquor, and they mix it with a huge amount of the cheapest, most awful well liquor they can find in the basement. But if their ratio is off by even a fraction of a percent, the chemical reaction causes the drink to instantly curdle into a solid block of black cement, and it shatters the glass on the bar.
That is a very vivid but highly accurate way to visualize the economic and physical risk. You're chasing pennies of margin, but if you miscalculate the chemistry, you destroy the glass. So how do engineers prevent the glass from shattering?
Math, right.
Yes. The MDPI study focuses heavily on the predictive chemistry. Refineries use compatibility indices. Specifically, they measure two crucial values: the solubility blending number, or SBN, and the maximum insolubility number, or INMAX.
The SBN and the NMAX. And there is a golden mathematical rule for the ratio between these two numbers.
Yes. The traditional industry standard rule of thumb is that the ratio of the blend's SBN divided by its Nmax must be greater than 1.4. If that ratio stays above 1.4, the mixture is considered colloidally stable. The solvent power of the blend is high enough that the resin shells will stay intact and the asphaltenes will safely remain in suspension.
But the MDPI study didn't just look at theories. They looked at actual real-world data from a functioning refinery. And this refinery wasn't just mixing two oils, they were blending 17 different crude oils simultaneously.
Which is incredibly complex.
1 extra light, 5 light, 9 medium, and 2 heavy crudes. They were aggressively pushing the economic limits by introducing a heavily discounted, highly incompatible opportunity crude designated as ITR. What exactly happened when they pushed that limit?
The study meticulously tracked the results. As the refinery increased the percentage of that heavy, incompatible ITR crude in the 17 crude cocktail, the overall SBN max ratio began to drop, inching closer to that dangerous 1.4 threshold. But the fascinating finding was that long before the overall mixture fully precipitated, they started experiencing massive localized failures in one specific piece of equipment at the very front of the refinery, the crude desalter.
Okay, we need to understand the desalter. What is a crude desalter and why does it fail first?
The desalter is the very first critical step in the refining process. When raw crude comes out of the ground, it contains microscopic droplets of highly salty formation water. If you let that salt enter the high-temperature distillation towers downstream, the salt will break down into hydrochloric acid and rapidly destroy the metal pipes. So you have to wash the salt out.
Wait, how do you wash oil? Oil and water don't mix.
Precisely because they don't mix. Inside the massive desalter vessel, they inject fresh water into the crude oil and physically churn it up, creating an emulsion. The freshwater droplets absorb the salt out of the oil. But then, you have to separate the salty water back out of the oil before it leaves the vessel.
How do they do that?
To do this, the desalter uses a massive, high-voltage electrical grid suspended inside the tank. The electrical field polarizes the water droplets, causing them to attract each other, coalesce into larger drops, and sink to the bottom where the water is drained away.
But the MDPI study showed that the asphaltenes disrupted this electrical process. How?
Because asphaltenes are highly polar and sticky, when the mixture became unstable, the precipitating asphaltenes migrated to the boundary layer between the oil and the water droplets. They essentially formed a rigid, solid film around the water droplets. Because of this rigid film, the water droplets could no longer touch each other and coalesce. The emulsion became incredibly stable.
The water was trapped in the oil?
Exactly. And because water is highly conductive, as this stable emulsion of water droplets rose higher and higher inside the vessel and entered the high-voltage electrical grid, it began conducting the electricity between the grid plates. The study noted a massive, dangerous spike in the electrical current. The desalter's amperage spiked and maxed out at 180 amps.
180 amps. If an electrical grid in a giant tank of highly flammable crude oil draws too much current, it short circuits. And if the desalter short circuits, it trips offline, and the entire multi-billion-dollar refinery comes to a screeching halt.
Right. And alongside that terrifying 180 amp spike, the engineers also recorded massive drops in thermal efficiency in the heat exchangers immediately downstream, proving that the asphaltene sludge was baking out of the pipes. The ultimate conclusion of the study was a warning. While traditional metrics like the 1.4 SBN max ratio are helpful guidelines, trying to predict the exact colloidal stability of a 17 crude blend using simple math is impossible. The interactions are just too complex.
Which brings us to the ultimate synthesis of chemistry, economics, and modern computing. Because the refineries aren't just guessing anymore. The sources detail how modern downstream operators manage this insane complexity using linear programming or LP models. We are talking about massive supercomputer algorithms.
Linear programming is the invisible brain of the modern refinery. An LP model is a mathematical optimization algorithm. It takes thousands of variables simultaneously. It looks at the real-time spot price of 50 different crude oils around the world. It looks at shipping costs. It looks at the current crack spread for gasoline versus diesel.
And he calculates the chemistry, too.
Crucially, yes. It inputs all the chemical constraints, the sulfur limits of the final product, the metallurgy limits of the pipes, and the asphaltene stability parameters. The algorithm runs millions of iterations to calculate the absolute mathematically optimal recipe that will yield the highest possible profit margin without destroying the plant.
And what fascinates me is how the algorithm handles the physics of the blending itself. Because calculating the blend isn't always straightforward. Some properties are easy, right? They are additive.
Yes, Properties like specific gravity or total sulfur content are generally additive. They follow linear math. If you mix 50% of a crude that has 1% sulfur with 50% of a crude that has 3% sulfur, the resulting blend will have a simple weighted average of 2% sulfur. The LP model handles that instantly.
But the challenge for the supercomputer is the non-additive properties, things like viscosity, pour point, and especially the asphaltene stability we just talked about. You can't just average those numbers together.
You really can't. If you mix two oils with different viscosities, the resulting thickness is not a straight average. It behaves unpredictably. To solve this, the linear programming models have to utilize highly complex empirical logarithmic equations. They use historical data and nonlinear math to approximate and predict how the final synthetic crude will behave physically when it's heated to 900 degrees.
And they are doing this continuously in real time. The technology has advanced so far. One of the technical PDFs we reviewed mentions the use of NMR nuclear magnetic resonance process analyzers. That sounds like medical technology.
It is exactly the same underlying technology as an MRI machine in a hospital. Refineries literally have industrial NMR spectrometers clamped directly onto the massive steel pipes feeding the distillation towers. As the crude oil flows through the pipe at thousands of gallons a minute, the NMR analyzer generates a massive magnetic field.
An MRI for an oil pipe?
Basically, yeah. This magnetic field aligns the protons in the hydrogen atoms of the hydrocarbon molecules. By hitting those protons with radio waves and measuring how they resonate, the analyzer can determine the exact microscopic molecular structure of the oil as it is moving.
In milliseconds.
In milliseconds, it measures the Sarah fractions, the viscosity, the exact distillation curve in real time, and it feeds that live chemical data directly back into the linear programming supercomputer.
So it's an active feedback loop.
Exactly. If the algorithm detects that the asphaltenes are getting dangerously close to precipitating, it instantly sends an automated signal to the blending valves to reduce the flow of the heavy opportunity crude by a fraction of a percent.
They are riding the absolute razor's edge of physics. They are mathematically maximizing the volume of the cheapest, dirtiest crude possible, right up to the exact molecular boundary of catastrophic failure. And because a modern refinery is processing 300,000 or 400,000 barrels of oil every single day, squeezing out an extra 5 cents of margin per barrel through that algorithm translates into millions and millions of dollars of pure profit every year.
It is the ultimate manifestation of Rockefeller's vision. Efficiency pushed to the molecular level.
It is genuinely staggering to step back and look at the whole picture. Let's summarize the journey we've just been on. We started this deep dive with a premise that the true genius, the real power of the oil industry, isn't found by a guy covered in mud striking a gusher in the dirt. And looking at the sheer scale of what we've unpacked, I think the sources prove that undeniably.
It's all about the toll booth.
This entire empire is built on the relentless, uncompromising mathematical pursuit of efficiency. We have traced a direct evolutionary line from John D. Rockefeller sitting in an office, manually forcing workers to use exactly 39 drops of solder on a tin can, all the way to modern supercomputers running logarithmic linear programming algorithms, fed by real-time magnetic resonance scanners, just to keep microscopic asphaltene particles from clumping together inside a desalter grid.
It is arguably the most complex architectural marvel of logistics, chemistry, and economics ever constructed by human beings.
It is a marvel. There's no denying the engineering brilliance of it. But if we pull the lens back one final time and look at the macro trends, all of this incredible optimization raises a deeply provocative question about the future.
It definitely does.
We have spent over a century and trillions of dollars building this vast, hyper-optimized infrastructure. We've designed European refineries constrained to exact assays. We have built massive U.S. cokers with Nelson complexity indices of 11, designed to perfectly crack the heaviest hydrocarbon molecules on Earth. But as global demand inevitably shifts, as electric vehicle adoption accelerates, and global regulations aggressively push the market toward decarbonization and alternative energy, what happens to this incredibly tuned machine?
That is the multi-trillion-dollar question. Will this massive algorithm-driven infrastructure of the downstream sector find a way to adapt? Can these incredibly complex, highly specific coking units and desulfurization towers be retrofitted to refine synthetic e-fuels or handle advanced biological feedstocks? Or, because they are so hyper-specialized for crude oil, is this vast continent-spanning network of steel and supercomputers destined to become the most expensive, most technologically complex stranded asset in human history?
That is a staggering, heavy thought to leave on. The
Mhm.
greatest, most efficient toll booth ever built, suddenly waking up to find itself sitting on a highway that nobody drives on anymore.
Wow.
Or maybe, knowing the history of this industry, they just find an entirely new way to count the drops of solder. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the true life cycle of oil. Keep exploring, keep looking past the surface, and we will catch you on the next deep dive.